In 1545, Spain discovered a mountain in South America made almost entirely of silver. It was the largest silver deposit in human history. They mined it for 150 years. They extracted more silver than had existed in all of Europe combined. Then they went bankrupt. The silver did it. Potosí sits at 4,000 meters above sea level in what is now Bolivia. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1545, they found a mountain with veins of silver running through it like roots. Within a decade, it had become the largest city in the Western Hemisphere. The Spanish did not ask why. They assumed it would last forever. At its peak, Potosí produced more than half of all the silver in the world. The Spanish phrase, vale un Potosí, worth of Potosí, entered the language as a synonym for wealth without limit. That phrase tells you everything you need to know about what went wrong. They believed the mountain was unlimited. It was not. The silver did not come free. Between 1545 and 1825, an estimated 8 million indigenous and African enslaved workers died in the Potosí mines. The Spanish called it mita, a rotating labor conscription. Workers descended into tunnels filled with mercury fumes used in the silver extraction process, and rarely returned in the condition they went in. 8 million people. The mountain produced wealth that built cathedrals across Europe. The cost was paid by people whose names were never recorded. And none of it saved Spain. When Spain began flooding Europe with Potosí silver, something happened that nobody had a framework to understand. A loaf of bread that cost 1 maravedì in 1500 cost 4 by 1600. A soldier's annual wage bought half what it had a generation earlier. Landlords, merchants, and ordinary workers watched their savings lose value year by year, without a single war touching their town. The mechanism was invisible until it wasn't. More silver in circulation meant each coin was worth slightly less, every year, for 100 years. The people who felt it first were not economists. They were bakers, soldiers, and farmers who could no longer afford what they had always been able to afford. Spain had created a slow-moving catastrophe and mistaken it for prosperity. Spain's response to the silver windfall was to buy, not to build. The empire imported food, weapons, textiles, and luxury goods from the rest of Europe, paying in silver. Why develop Spanish industry when you could simply buy whatever you needed? Why invest in manufacturing when the mountain kept producing? The answer arrived slowly, then all at once. Spanish manufacturers could not compete with cheaper imports. The domestic industry that might have employed Spanish workers and created durable wealth simply stopped developing. Spain became dependent on imports for goods it had once produced itself, and dependent on Potosí silver to pay for them. When the silver eventually slowed, as all mines do, there was nothing underneath it. No industry, no diversified economy, just the habit of spending money that was no longer coming. England and the Dutch Republic had no silver, no Potosí, no mountain producing half the world's monetary supply. What they had instead was the necessity to manufacture, to trade, to build industries that created value rather than just extracted it. By 1600, Dutch textile production, English shipbuilding, and the financial innovations of Amsterdam were generating more durable wealth than all the silver in Potosí. The countries with no treasure built the next century. The country with the treasure spent it. Between 1557 and 1696, the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy 6 times. Not once, 6 times. Each bankruptcy was followed by a restructuring, new loans, and the promise that Potosí would eventually cover the debt. It never did. The problem was timing. Every war Spain fought required payment immediately. The silver from Potosí took months to cross the Atlantic, and by the time it arrived, the debt it was supposed to cover had already grown. The solution was to borrow against the next shipment, then the one after that. Spain was spending silver that existed only as a promise, secured by a mountain it no longer fully controlled. To manage the gap between silver arrivals and payment deadlines, Spain turned to Genoese bankers. The arrangement was elegant and devastating. The bankers would advance cash to the Spanish crown immediately. In return, they received the rights to the next silver shipment directly, before it reached the Spanish treasury. By the late 1500s, most of the silver leaving Potosí never touched Spanish soil in any meaningful sense. It was already spoken for. It flowed from the mines in Bolivia, across the Atlantic, and directly into the accounts of Genoese creditors who had lent Spain money it had already spent. The empire still flew its flag over half the world, but the money, as in the Ottoman Empire a century later, belonged to someone else. In 1588, Spain sent 130 warships against England. The Armada was the largest naval force ever assembled in European history, financed with borrowed money, secured against the next Potosí silver shipment. England's fleet was smaller, but England's ships had been built in English shipyards by English craftsmen, paid for with wealth generated by English industries. Spain lost 63 ships. The storm that finished the Armada was blamed. The real reason was simpler. Spain arrived with silver it didn't have yet. England fought with money it had already earned. Spain did not collapse dramatically. It faded. The silver from Potosí slowed in the 1600s as the richest veins were exhausted. The wars continued. The debts remained. The industries that were never built were still not there. What replaced the age of Spanish dominance was not a revolution or a defeat. It was simply the Dutch, and then the English, doing quietly what Spain had never bothered to do: making things. What happened to Spain has a name now. Economists call it the resource curse, the pattern by which countries with extraordinary natural wealth fail to build the economies that less wealthy countries are forced to develop. The mechanism is always the same. The resource replaces the need to build. And when the resource eventually runs out, as it always does, there is nothing underneath it. Spain had the largest silver deposit in history. What it never had was the discipline that comes from not having enough. That discipline built England. It built the Dutch Republic. It built the world that came after Spain. Spain found the largest silver deposit in history and went bankrupt 6 times. The question is not what they did wrong. The question is, what does it look like when a country is living off a resource instead of building something? And how would you know the difference from the inside?